And dear brothers and sisters, welcome to the Priest's Reflections blog, and we will continue to read the sayings of the Desert Fathers today. Let us pray and we will proceed. O heavenly King, comforter the Spirit of truth, who whatever represent and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us, and cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. So, sorry. I forgot to take the epitrachelion off. I was doing some prayers earlier. And so we stopped last time at the letter Iota. So today we're going to read about St. John the Dwarf. He is one of very well-known fathers of the desert, and a great one at that. Somebody who is truly, I think, going to be edifying and beneficial to us. John the Dwarf, son of poor parents in Tese, or Tese, T-E-S-E, was born about 339. The second story here clearly belongs to his youth at home before he became a monk, while he was living with his family. At the age of 18, he went to Cetis and was trained by Abba Amos for 12 years. One of the most vivid characters in the desert, he attracted many disciples, and in order to preserve his own solitude, he dug himself a cave underground. He was ordained priest, and the number of his sayings recorded and preserved points to his importance among his disciples. After 407 AD, he went to Suez and the mountain of St. Anthony, or mountain of Antony, so I'm assuming that would be the mountain of St. Anthony the Great. Something here that's worth noting is that he was trained by Abba Amos for 12 years. Oftentimes, when we read about the lives of the Desert Fathers, we make this assumption that they became, monastics, Christians, and immediately headed out to the desert. That is not the case, not at all. St. Anthony the Great specifically is the very sort of primal example. Most of them actually spent a good number of years in training with an experienced elder, and only after they were considered reasonable and discerning enough to live on their own, they would venture out. Chapter 1. It was said of Abba John the Dwarf that he withdrew and lived in the desert at Cetis with an old man of Thebes. His Abba, taking a piece of dry wood, planted it and said to him, "Water it every day with a bottle of water until it bears fruit." Now the water was so far away that he had to leave in the evening and return the following morning. At the end of 3 years, the wood came to life and bore fruit. Then the old monk took some of the fruit and carried it to the church, saying to the brethren, "Take and eat the fruit of obedience." Now, this is one of my favorite stories. It's quite amazing if you think about it. Here it says, so he took a piece of dry wood. Elsewhere, it says that he actually took a staff, which basically means it's a stick that's been, polished, or if not polished, at least, carved and cut. And he just stuck it in the ground and told St. John the Dwarf to water it until it brought forth fruit. At the end of 3 years, by God's grace and by his obedience, it did. And if anything, that ought to teach us obedience and patience. Now, sometimes people jump immediately to a conflict in obedience, and they say, well, what if my spiritual father, what if my confessor tells me to do something that is wrong? Of course, our conscience would not betray us. The gospel would not betray us. If our spiritual father, if our priest, confessor, or, sort of a figure of spiritual authority tells us to do something contrary to the gospel or contrary to God's commandments, we should pay attention and then choose rather to obey God, of course. But in this particular case, this was what you would call a gray area. It was not necessarily a commandment of virtue. He wasn't saying give alms or fast or pray. He basically told them to water a stick, a dry stick. Now, some people would say, well, this is insane. Why would I do something like that? It's ridiculous. But he did. And because of his obedience and perseverance, since he spent an entire night, 3 years in a row, walking to get water and coming back in the middle of the night, I imagine it was a great exercise in the sort of subduing of fear as well, because, in the desert, you could have wild animals and various things. He persevered. St. John the Dwarf persevered. But then think about what a great strengthening of his own faith he received through that obedience. He watered a dry stick, something that would have seemed completely ridiculous to a majority of people today. Imagine like somebody gave you a broomstick and said, you water it. Well, none of us would actually probably do that, but he did. And it came to life and it bore fruit. And I imagine that it served as a great strengthening of his own faith as well. That if you do something consistently, if you pray consistently, it can bear fruit. And you could even say that in some ways, this is what our souls are like. Our souls, darkened and dried and withered by sin, are like dry sticks. And when we put them in the ground, there are no roots. There are no connections to nutrients or anything. So, when we plant ourselves in the ground of the church or in the ground of pious life, and yet if we persevere, if we continue on a daily basis to water the dry sticks of our souls with the water of contrition, of repentance, and of prayer to God with unfailing faith, that he would hear us and that he would respond, then indeed even our barren, withered, and dry souls can become living and bearing fruit. So this truly is a very great story, in my opinion. Chapter 2. It was said of Abba John the Dwarf that one day he said to his elder brother, I should like to be free of all care, like the angels who do not work, but ceaselessly offer worship to God. So he took off his cloak and went away into the desert. After a week he came back to his brother. When he knocked on the door, he heard his brother say, before he opened it, Who are you? He said, I am John, your brother. But he replied, John has become an angel, and henceforth he is no longer among men. Then the other begged him, saying, It is I. However, his brother did not let him in, but left him there in distress until morning. Then, opening the door, he said to him, You are a man, and you must once again work in order to eat. Then John made a prostration before him, saying, Forgive me. Now, at the beginning, we read that this probably refers to his early life. Let's see. Where does it say that? It says the second story here clearly belongs to his youth at home before he became a monk. Actually, I would beg to disagree, and especially considering the fact that these little comments are not written by Orthodox people. They're, written by the Cistercians. Not to offend the Cistercians in any way, but at any rate, elsewhere, somewhere I read that this in fact happened when he was already a monk and they were already living together in a cell. He was living with his older brother, and so he told his older brother that he wanted to be like an angel and live in the desert and do nothing. But then his brother decided to teach him a lesson and didn't let him in and said, no, John is an angel now. He's not here. But he was cold. He was cold and he was hungry, and so he wanted to come in. But he was, in fact, attempting to acquire a life of complete contemplation without any work whatsoever, which, of course, was never the case. And if you read enough about the lives of the Desert Fathers, maybe not just in these sayings, but if you read some of the lives, like the life of St. Anthony, the life of St. Macarius of Egypt, if you read the ancient Patericon, you will see there that they all engaged in physical labor. They worked, they made various handiwork, whether it was the weaving of baskets or of ropes, and they sold their handiwork and procured means for living, out in the desert, and for food and clothing for themselves. So indeed, St. John essentially naively thought that he could do nothing and survive in the desert. And there were some anchorites who were like that. They achieved that status. And even in those stories, what you read is that obviously they still had to eat. There's a story about a particular saint. When he was discovered, either by one or two men, they saw a small spring near his cave and a fig tree. And they were quite amazed at the fact that the fig tree lowered sort of its fruit once a day. So the monk would literally be able to take it, eat it, and that was that. And when he told the person who found him, he said that God sort of gave him the gift of the fig tree, that fig tree grew up, whether he planted it, by planting the seed, or he was able to find, sort of an already small tree that he was able to look after. But he considered it God's providence for himself, that he didn't starve to death, so he was able to eat that. So even the anchorites obviously had to eat. They had to be sheltered. They had caves. And St. John figured that he would just eat nothing and live out in the open, sort of under the open sky. So his brother taught him a lesson. In love, of course. But it was somewhat cute because St. John was rather distressed when he came back and he was knocking on the door. So please let me in. He says, no. And of course, also, if we pay attention, when we read about the diabolical temptations of the Desert Fathers, you could say that his brother was also justified, potentially thinking that it was a demon pretending to be St. John the Dwarf. And that's why he didn't let him in, at least not until morning and after perhaps some prayer. So anyway, chapter 3, Abba John the Dwarf said, if a king wanted to take possession of his enemy's city, he would begin by cutting off the water and the food, so his enemies, dying of hunger, would submit to him. It is the same with the passions of the flesh. If a man goes about fasting and hungry, the enemies of his soul grow weak. Now, think about this in a way that may be somewhat new. This is a strategic saying of a saint who is a desert dweller. And what he's saying is that if you are trying to conquer a passion, you must be strategic, just as a king applies strategy by cutting off water and food supplies from the enemy city so that the people are forced by hunger and thirst to surrender. In the same way, it would be absolutely foolish on a part not only of monastics, but of any Christian, if we make an effort to fight a particular sin or particular passion, if we do not cut off sort of the things that feed this passion, we must be very careful and very discerning in cutting these things off from us. In some cases, you would say that when the Lord says, remember in the gospel, he says, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of heaven without an eye than with both eyes to be cast into the fiery Gehenna. And then he says the same thing about the hand and the same thing about a foot or a leg. Well, quite clearly, it is allegorical. He is not speaking of an actual bodily member. He is speaking of maybe a member of the family or a friend, someone who's leading us into sin. He says basically it is up to us to cut off this relationship so that we do not perish, even though we might consider this person, like a member of the family or somebody like a member of our own body. Now, that's not to say, we're maybe to cut off it to such an extent that we absolutely cease all contact with a person, but maybe at least to limit that contact so that it does not lead us to sin. And so, in the light of this saying of St. John the Dwarf, if you're trying to cut off certain passions, well, you must cut down, or you must block the stimuli, the things that sort of prompt this passion. If you don't want to judge people, well, curb your eyes, try not to pay attention, and certainly restrain your conversation with other people where perhaps third parties come up and are discussed and are being judged. If you are tempted to be envious, don't make it your business to know what somebody else has or what he's doing, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, yes, of course, there's also a very sort of a patristic direct meaning, in the sense that if you keep vigil, you're tired, you're sleepy. If you are hungry by fasting, then the passions are weakened, meaning your body as the instrument of the enemy's affront or assail on you, because the enemy is using the very body to attack us. The bodily passions, they sort of present an obstacle for us, a hindrance in spiritual growth. So if you subjugate your own body by fasting, by keeping vigil, you give your spirit a bit of an advantage, because you have the upper hand. You can actually sort of have better control. But even that has to be practiced with discernment, with great restraint, and of course not just limited to that, but also to other things in life. If you have friends who entice you in sinful, sort of to engage in sinful activities, such as drinking or smoking buddies, or if you know somebody who is using illegal drugs, or even as in our case in Canada, cannabis is legal now, but it doesn't make it good. At any rate, if you know people who encourage you in these kind of things, or if you have a friend who is sort of extremely promiscuous and is always looking for adventures, well, if you're going to be next to this friend, you're going to end up sort of participating or observing things that could be greatly harmful. Well, restrain, step away from this friendship, cut it off. And of course, most certainly, if you have friends who are engaged in illegal activities and criminal activities, walk away. The sooner the better. And that way you would sort of stem the flow of the things that stimulate your passions. Chapter 4. He also said, "He who gorges himself and talks with a boy has already in his thought committed fornication with him." Now, this might sound really, really bad, well, I won't name the sins in particular, but the reason why in some monasteries, for example, they did not admit young men unless they had a beard. Sort of a youth was not allowed to enter the monastery until he grew a beard, until he sort of looked more like a man, that he, sort of looked manly in his appearance. The reason for that is not because they had homosexual tendencies as such, but because in that complete absence of women, if, in the man's monastery you have no women whatsoever at all, then a boy's face, which has no facial hair, could actually sort of, remind you of a woman's face. And so in that sense, this is what happened at times. That's the reason why. In fact, that's why St. Cosmas the Aetolian said, a man of 50 years without a beard is a scandal, because why would a man look like a woman? Why would he attempt that? Because it can tempt other men, not toward homosexual tendencies, but really it would inflame their desire of a woman by seeing a boy's face. That is what that refers to. Now, someone is asking how to overcome laziness in prayer. Please give an advice. I would say that even great saints always struggled with prayer. Prayer never comes easy, because if it did, well, everybody around us would be a saint. Everybody around us would be, a man or a woman of prayer. Prayer is a sacrifice to God. Sacrifice isn't a sacrifice unless it hurts to give. And so we talked, especially last week when we read, about doing violence to oneself, right? So the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and violent men take it by force. Well, violence has to be done sort of by forcing ourselves to pray. There will always be the necessity to force yourself. There's not really a time in life where prayer will come naturally. Prayer comes naturally when we're in trouble and we're sort of calling, for help. I remember a time in my life when a person, very dear and near to me was in the hospital, and yes, I prayed like never before. I can't take credit for that. That prayer was driven by fear of, potential sort of, illness of somebody that I really love. The one thing that would be very practical, because there is a request for advice on how to deal with it, how to fight this laziness in prayer, I would say that in this case, one must form a good habit. So if you have a particular rule, and you have to be wise, you have to be discerning, your rule of prayer should never be so complicated, so difficult, that it really feels like a major chore and you will end up giving up because it's too much. Your rule of prayer has to be manageable in the morning, in the evening, or throughout the day, whichever you choose. It has to be something that you can actually accomplish. And then you must do it on a daily basis. You must do it every single day. And someone might say, well, but if it becomes automatic, would it be actually useful? The usefulness of that would be if you get to the point where not to pray, you would feel really bad, because you would sort of break your habit. So you would pray. The automatic becomes the vehicle for the grace of God to visit you and to fill you. Yes, you might be saying the words of prayer automatically at some point in time, though, as it becomes more easy, and sort of more habitual, instead of focusing on forcing yourself and struggling with prayer and reading without mistakes, you might actually be able to pay attention to the content of the prayer that you are saying, and in that case, you will definitely receive the grace of God. And so just like with any skill, in order to be good at something, you must do it, and you must do it a lot. Nobody becomes sort of an artist at something. Nobody becomes, I don't want to say professional, but nobody becomes maybe proficient at something without doing it a lot. Experience, empirical experience in the practice of virtue has tremendous value. It's not enough just to read a book about prayer. You must pray every day. In fact, the scripture says, God gives prayer to the one who prays. Why? Think of it this way. My father-in-law, whom I love greatly, when he was alive, once answered a question of mine. I said to him, Dad, how is it that, you have all these wonderful photographs? How did you become a good photographer? He smiled and said, I'm not a good photographer, but I take a lot of pictures, and some of them turn out. And so what that basically means, it's really a brilliant strategy, and it's important in all areas of life. If you want to succeed at something, you must try, you must make many attempts. The more attempts you make, the more chances are that you will succeed. If you only try once or twice, you will give up and you will never learn something. Think of it this way. When we seek out a teacher, when we seek out an instructor, when we seek out sort of an example, somebody, that could show us something, we never go to someone who's done it just a handful of times. We try to find someone who's done it for years, who's done it consistently, who has really, really and truly learned this, who can, in speaking in English, someone who could do it with his eyes closed. That's the kind of person that we want to learn from. Because if we learn from somebody who's just beginning to do it, well, that person hasn't really been tested. In fact, the Russian word art, искусство, has the same root as the word искус, which means a test. So really, when we say in Russian, искусный художник, like an experienced artist, or a skilled artist, what we're saying is a tested artist, someone who's done it so many times that he has really gained that experience. There is also a Russian saying that basically says the first pancake is always, messed up. It's always bunched up, like lump. The first pancake is a lump. I guess that's первый блин комом. That's how it's translated. Yes, a cook that has made pancakes for years will eventually get to the point where even the first one will come out okay. But the first day of cooking, yes, there will be plenty of lumps and various things, and things seasoned, inappropriately, or burned or not cooked all the way through, because there's not enough experience. And in order to gain this experience, you must persevere in the practice of what it is you're trying to achieve. Maybe, in fact, at this point, I can actually say just a little bit about the practice that you might have observed in my Instagram photos or stories. You see me doing latte art, and a lot of people think that, I'm a huge coffee fan. Not so much a coffee fan as much as I intentionally tried to learn to do that in order to see how do you acquire a skill? How do you, learn something? And I can tell you for certain that unlike baristas who work in cafes and they make maybe 100 lattes per day, maybe 200, so they have a tremendous volume of practice. I could never do something nearly as good as they would. They could probably, pour beautiful, just masterpiece latte art, cup after cup. Sometimes I do okay, sometimes I don't. Why? Wednesday and Friday are 2 fasting days. I don't do it then. I don't bother with the soy or almond milk or oat milk or anything like that. So, I drink espresso. So my latte art days are Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, when I'm at home and early enough to drink coffee. And, if I have somebody visiting, I'll make 1, 2, maybe 3 cups per day, maybe 4 at the most. My experience is very limited. Therefore, my skill level is nowhere near the people who do it on a consistent and a larger volume level. Why do you think is it that there are so few saints among the laity and so many among the monastics, or in some cases among the clergy? It's not because the monastics are special or they're different from us. They're the same flesh and bones, as we are. But while we are busy, earning money, going about our, daily lives, raising children, dealing with problems, fixing things that break at our homes, driving our cars, going on vacations, and so on. And the time that we spend in spiritual acquisition of virtue, the time that we spend in prayer, the time that we attend church services is minuscule compared to the time that the monastics put into it. Because once they've embraced the monastic life, on daily basis they are engaged in prayer. On daily basis they're engaged in, spiritual reading and the acquisition of virtue. Therefore, they produce far greater results than we do. Not to say that we cannot obtain salvation, not at all. But the monastics and Saint Ignatius Brinchinov actually said they're like the nursery flowers. We're growing wild in the field and among the rocks, or by the roadside. They are sort of dedicated to be pretty dedicated spiritually. That is, sort of grown in an orchard or grown in a nursery where they're given the proper attention. They have that experience. So if you want to acquire, if you want to conquer your laziness in prayer, make sure that you develop a habit, that every single day without fail you pray, or that a particular day per week without fail you read maybe an akathist or something on a day of the week, and you do it every single week, and you have to do it for years. There is a beautiful joke, in fact. It's cultural, not really political, and I'm certainly not using it for the cultural or sort of ethnic reasons. It's Anglo-British, along the lines, but an American tourist, is passing by an estate in England, and he sees this absolutely beautiful lawn, just beautiful, gorgeous, and a man is cutting it. He says to him, "Oh, how did you get such a nice lawn?" And the British man says, "Oh, it's easy. You just cut it regularly for 300 years." So that's the point of it, that when you do something consistently, you do it for a long time, you gain experience. It happens sometimes imperceivably. You don't even think that you're growing. Well, just like in your childhood, as you're growing, you don't really notice that you've grown a centimeter or an inch. You just get bigger and bigger and bigger after a while. And I remember in my teenage years coming back to my grandmother's apartment, from previous summer to the summer that I actually remember this happening. I walked in and I said, "Ooh, who shrank the place?" Like it got smaller. It didn't. I grew up physically. I got bigger, because it was that teenage year where I really sort of, had a growth spurt, and it seemed smaller. In some cases, in spiritual life, temptation to temptation or major crisis to major crisis, you might actually see that you did in fact grow. But day to day, you won't notice it much at all. And that's the most important thing, because you don't notice that daily growth. You don't notice that daily gain of experience. It's easy to quit. It's easy to give up. It's easy to say, well, nothing's happening. Why am I going through this again? No, that's what the enemy wants you to think. The enemy wants you to think that it's useless and nothing's happening. Think of it this way, the beautiful example that the fathers always use. If you, hang a barrel of water, over a rock, and you make the hole too big, all the water will run out quickly and nothing will happen. But if you make a small enough hole and let it drip, just drip, 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 in a year or so, your stone will have an indentation from where the water is dripping into it. And after a number of years, it might actually sort of drill a hole through the stone. If you pour water into your own hand out of a cup, it would not drill a hole in your hand. And you think to yourself, it's useless. It's useless because you're looking at it in too narrow window of a time. In the same way, when you say your morning prayers or you say your evening prayers and you look at that just in the framework of that one day, you think, well, it's not really that important if I pray or if I don't pray. But when you look at it through the years, if you pray every single day, you say a certain prayer, in 5 years, that prayer becomes part of you. It becomes a part of your soul, of your mind, and you memorize it so well that in a critical instance, if something happens, you can recall it easily without having to open a book. If you pray, you pray one day, you don't pray another day, it never becomes part of you. You never develop that skill. So in that sense, and I'm sorry that, maybe you could say I went off on a tangent, but if you want to learn to pray and you want to conquer laziness, make sure that you establish a routine. Yes, it sounds like, well, a routine is not something good, but in essence, and it's not just a patristic saying. It seems like, some of the other ancient people said that. Obtain a habit, or sort of make something a habit. A habit will become, part of your character, and character will change your life. Forgive me, I'm not following this, sort of exactly. There may be a couple other, intermediary steps there, but basically, if you do something enough, it'll become a habit. A habit will become a part of your character. Character, will change your life, because that stays with you forever. So that's what you have to do with prayer. You have to practice it on a daily basis until literally you can't live without it. It becomes part of you. Chapter 5. He also said, going up the road again toward Cetes with some ropes, I saw the camel driver talking, and he made me angry. So leaving my goods, I took to flight. This is a perfect example also of cutting off one's hand or a foot. Maybe that actually refers to something material and not, as what I mentioned earlier, not as to a particular individual, or a friend or a close relative. In this case, having to sell his handiwork required him to hear this, camel driver, who was probably, speaking in a way that was a great temptation for St. John. And so St. John just left his stuff on the side of the road and turned around and walked away, rather than haul it with him. He just left it and took the flight, which means he valued the peace of his soul. He valued the state of grace, because if you lose peace within, if you become agitated and angry, you lose God's grace. Where there is peace, there is God. God's grace is present in a peaceful heart. It cannot be in a heart that's raging with a storm, of anger and calumny and condemnation of a fellow man. So he left the material work, which would have been actually sort of the guarantee of him, having enough to eat and everything. He left it. He left his week's work or a month's work or however long he worked it. He left it and fled to protect the peace. That tells us something also. You see, he valued the grace far more than he valued a material possession, which the monastics didn't have much, and for him it was a matter of livelihood. He wasn't selling these ropes to make money for the sake of money. He was only to sort of, make sure that he can continue living the way that he did in the desert. But in this case, he set it aside and fled. Chapter 6. On another occasion in summertime, he heard a brother talking angrily to his neighbor, saying, "Ah, you too?" So leaving the harvest, he took to flight. So basically, he heard two monastics, arguing or quarreling about something, turned around and walked away. Again, so as not to be tempted, so as not to be drawn into that conflict. Because, of course, sometimes you don't say anything, but you actually sort of participate in this. And an interesting thing, something that explains it and supports it quite beautifully. Recently, I read a book. The title of it is perhaps questionable because it uses somewhat bad language. The book is titled, Don't Work with Bad People. I'm paraphrasing, or like Survival of Bad People. And in the book, the author, he's Cambridge. I think he's a Cambridge professor. And he talks about the fact that quite a few people leave the workplaces, where they work, not because they're the ones being abused, but because they're witnessing abuse. They're seeing their bosses mistreat their coworkers. And before that happens to them, they quit, they leave, they choose to work in a better environment. They don't want to be in what people now call toxic environment. So we see that this, in fact, was practiced by the saints in the desert, that if they saw something that was disturbing to their inner peace, they turned around and walked away. They left material possessions, and at the time of harvest, again, this was a way for him to sort of make sure he had bread enough to eat, because they would hire themselves to farmers, help them collect harvest, and the farmers would pay them not in money but in grain, for example, right? So that they were able to have that grain milled, have flour, then they would bake bread, dry the bread, and then they would eat that dry bread for the remainder of the year until next harvest. Well, he gave up his supply of food for a year so as not to be judging the two brothers who were arguing. That's really something. Chapter 7. Some old men were entertaining themselves at Setes by having a meal together. Amongst them was Abba John. A venerable priest got up to offer drink, but nobody accepted any from him except John the dwarf. They were surprised and said to him, "How is it that you, the youngest, dare to let yourself be served by the priest?" Then he said to them, "When I get up to offer drink, I am glad when everyone accepts it, since I am receiving my reward. That is the reason, then, that I accepted it, so that he also might gain his reward and not be grieved by seeing that no one would accept anything from him." When they heard this, they were all filled with wonder and edification at his discretion. Now, this is a beautiful story. I read it elsewhere before. It's possibly mentioned by St. John of the Ladder in the Ladder of Divine Ascent as well, without maybe the mention of St. John the Dwarf. It basically says that when an elderly priest came and offered to pour, the fathers, everybody refused except for the youngest, and obviously the youngest here is St. John the Dwarf. He received this gift in order to allow the priest to receive his reward for doing a great labor. So that is truly a great exhibition of discernment and virtue on his part. Chapter 8. One day when he was sitting in front of the church, the brethren were consulting him about their thoughts. One of the old men who saw it became a prey to jealousy and said to him, "John, your vessel is full of poison." Abba John said to him, "That is very true, Abba, and you have said that when you only see the outside. But if you were able to see the inside too, what would you say then?" Now, this is quite beautiful. The person rebuked him on account of jealousy. He was envious, that the brethren were consulting him and not maybe the old man who spoke. And so, driven by jealousy, he told him that, his vessel is full of poison, maybe that, sort of his counsels and so on, his soul. And in true humility, this is not humble talk. This is not humble speech. He says, "You are absolutely right. My vessel is full of poison," because St. John the Dwarf knew his thoughts. He knew his struggles that he was having to deal with. He says, "You're absolutely right, and you only said that seeing the outside. What would you say if you saw the inside?" Which shows us that St. John the Dwarf was truly in position to give brethren good advice, since he was not affected by, the calumny of an older monk. In fact, he received it with proper humility. Chapter 9. The brethren used to tell how the brethren were sitting one day at an agape. Agape is like a feast of love or charity. Basically, it's potluck-like meal, where everybody sort of brought something and they shared it all together. That's what it meant, the feast of love. That for your love of the brethren, you would share sort of your best things. And one brother at table began to laugh. When he saw that, Abba John began to weep, saying, "What does this brother have in his heart that he should laugh, when he ought to weep because he is eating at an agape?" Now, I'm guessing this is just going to be a guess on my part. The reason he's saying he should weep because he's eating at an agape, at this kind of a meal, he's eating at a potluck like meal, meaning he's eating something that he had not earned by the labor of his hands. And so, therefore, he's eating and he's indebted. Why is he laughing? He should be weeping. You would only laugh if you're eating something that you have sort of gained by the labor of your own hands. This is most likely what that refers to. Chapter 10. Some brethren came one day to test him, to see whether he would let his thoughts get dissipated and speak of the things of this world. They said to him, "We give thanks to God that this year there has been much rain, and the palm trees have been able to drink, and their shoots have grown, and the brethren have found manual work." Abba John said to them, "So it is when the Holy Spirit descends into the hearts of men. They are renewed, and they put forth leaves in the fear of God." So they were basically seeing if he would start talking about the weather and the harvest and sort of material things. But whatever they said to him as an image of the material world, he immediately sort of reflected and refracted and redirected in a spiritual way. Chapter 11, I'm going to read basically to the next page so that we know where to start next time. It was said of him that one day he was weaving rope for 2 baskets, but he made it into one without noticing until it had reached the wall, because his spirit was occupied in contemplation. So he was basically doing his handiwork. He was working with his hands, and he worked and didn't even notice that he needed to stop, because he was praying and thinking of spiritual things. Chapter 12. Abba John said, "I'm like a man sitting under a great tree who sees wild beasts and snakes coming against him in great numbers. When he cannot withstand them any longer, he runs to climb the tree and is saved. It is just the same with me. I sit in my cell and I am aware of evil thoughts coming against me. And when I have no more strength against them, I take refuge in God by prayer, and I am saved from the enemy." That is a beautiful illustration. What he is saying here is that as he's sitting in his cell and he is engaged in spiritual reading or various work, handiwork, thoughts are assailing him like wild animals, coming to a man and climbing the tree, essentially. And especially interesting that he uses that allegory, of climbing a tree, because climbing the tree is a motion up, right? You're moving up the tree. So you avoid evil thoughts by lifting your mind to God, by climbing to God. And in fact, Valeria asked earlier how to overcome laziness in prayer. You see how beautiful it is. Prayer is an act of effort. You're making an effort. Climbing the tree is an effort. It's not easy to climb a tree. It's not like sliding down a slide, right? You just sit on your bum and you run, ride all the way down. Climbing the tree is both dangerous and difficult, and demands an exertion of strength. So it is with prayer, and that is why often in iconography the ascetic struggle of a saint is depicted either by a mountain behind him or maybe by trees. Sort of it points to a higher higher ground, higher place. As St. John the Dwarf raised his mind in prayer to God, the evil thoughts could not reach him. They could not get through to him. And that is why the fathers say that the safest way to overcome the temptation of the enemy is not to enter dialogue, is not to argue with the devil. The devil is very cunning and extremely smart. We're not praising him. We're just constituting a fact. He's been at destroying souls for quite a number of years. We don't have the experience to match him. Therefore, it is much safer for us to ascend to God in prayer, to raise our mind. And when our mind is filled with the memory of God, then the devil can't approach it. He can't sort of catch us. He can't snatch us away. Chapter 13. Abba Pimen said of Abba John the Dwarf that he had prayed God to take his passions away from him so that he might become free from care. He went and told an old man this. "I find myself in peace without an enemy." He said, I find myself in peace without an enemy, he said. The old man said to him, "Go beseech God to stir up warfare so that you may regain the affliction and humility that you used to have. for it is by warfare that the soul makes progress. So he besought God, and when the warfare came, he no longer prayed that it might be taken away, but said, Lord, give me strength for the fight. Now, this is a beautiful place to end, and it appears that basically this is the conversation between Abba Piman and Abba John the dwarf. John the dwarf tells him, I prayed, and I think elsewhere it says, I prayed for 7 years for God to give me complete peace and for all the passions to dissipate. And they did. I'm at peace. And St. Piman says, Abba Piman says, now go back and pray another 7 years that they come back, because this is the only way for you to grow and to be strong. Think of it this way. It's almost like an athlete coming into the gym and saying, I want peace, so I want all the equipment out. There's no equipment in my gym. I can actually relax. Well, that's great if relaxing is what you want to do. But if you want to be a champion, you need to continue using the equipment, because you need resistance in order to build strength. Strength is built by resistance. You can't build strength by just, moving your arms, your empty arms. You need to have a dumbbell or kettlebell, something, a jug with water, an iron, for ironing clothes. Do something. You have to, use your own weight to push it against the wall or against the floor, or pull it up to the bar. Resistance builds strength. In the same way, spiritual resistance builds spiritual strength. As you resist the various temptations, you become spiritually strong. That is why the fathers say, no one can be saved without temptations. In other words, you could never know the measure of your strength or the measure of your character if you are never tempted. Because when you're tempted, your character is revealed. Your response to the temptation is is the manifestation of your inclination. Are you inclined toward God? Are you inclined toward virtue? When certain things happen, are you trying to do them right, or are you inclined to something else? And in that way, I think that we could make some really interesting, conclusions about the intentions with which, for example, people come to church. Are they bothered by the necessity of wearing a head cover for a woman? Well, if the woman comes to church on a mission to, make sure that there's no requirement to wear a skirt or to wear a head covering, well, for what reason is she coming? And similar things could be said about men as well. If the direction of a priest means nothing for a man, if there is no obedience whatsoever at all, what is the purpose for being in church? Why are we there? Are we there to serve God, or are we there to do something else? And even these small little temptations, they certainly manifest our inclination. Are we inclined to search for salvation, to struggle to obtain the kingdom of heaven, or are we inclined toward whatever other, selfish or misguided ideas and principles that we want to pursue? At any rate, we read a little longer than 45 minutes. Do forgive me. I did talk extensively about building a skill of prayer and overcoming laziness. Do pray for me, a sinner. God willing, next week we will have our broadcast. Let me take a very quick look at the calendar. Next Wednesday we will have a vigil for the ascension, for the transfiguration of the Lord. So probably we will have the next broadcast on Friday, August the 20th, provided there is no vigil for the 21st. Yes, there will be a vigil on the 27th for the 28th. So there. Probably we will, in 2 weeks, we will do it on Wednesday. Do forgive me the sliding sort of schedule for these broadcasts. Some of you know we have a youth group at our parish. It meets every Thursday, usually at 6:45, with the exception of first Thursday every month when we start at 6:30. We're doing a cathist. At 6:45, we always serve a prayer service. Then we read the Holy Fathers and have tea downstairs in the church hall. So Thursday night is always taken up, and I have to then basically sort of juggle, the other evenings, or sometimes even daytimes, because I think there was one time we had all the evenings busy, so I had to do this broadcast during the day, maybe at 3 p.m. Do forgive me for the sliding schedule. Please pray for me. Please leave your comments and your requests. Send them in the chat when we are live. Leave them in the comments if you are watching this already as a recording on YouTube, and I will do my best to respond. Please pray for me, a sinner. God bless all of you, and hopefully see you all probably it would be in 9 days, so August 20th, Friday, God willing. Bye-bye.